There we go.
Did maybe say that? Thank you again.
Yeah. Ah, that's pretty good. So, Carey, for those who don't know you, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm a associate professor of history at Trinity University. I've been living in San Antonio for the last 17 years. I moved here in 2004, so I guess I'm not a newbie here.
Uh-huh.
I'm married to a wonderful woman named Almy. She's out here right now listening on, and I'm a member of Mount Zion First Baptist Church, associate minister there as well. My area of focus is African American Southern Civil War history, but I'm also involved in a lot of Alamo stuff right now.
Uh-huh.
So a lot of things happening. It's a really interesting time to be in San Antonio, but also a very interesting time to be black in America.
Yes, it is.
For a variety of reasons.
Now, are they going to keep the Woolworths there?
Yes,
Good.
I believe they're going to do that.
Good.
So
That's what I cared most about.
Yeah, so I think that's I think they're going to save all of those three buildings, those
Okay.
historic buildings, and it's going to be some type of museum. We're still working on those aspects, and so it's exciting times.
Yes,
Exciting
it is.
times.
And in addition to all the things we just talked about with the pandemic and everything else, and the really unusual weather, we've had it's been a great time for African Americans, but it's also been a very trying time.
Yeah.
Because it seems like every day there's new efforts that are underway to take away some of the civil rights that we gained back in the '60s. What do you think about that?
It's the best of times and the worst of times, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean,
There you go.
That's a song. I think this old Styx song.
That's
right.
right. '06.
And on one end, there's a tremendous interest in African American history right now, and that's a broad-based interest. And so, a lot of news media, other kind of media, they're interested in hearing our stories.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there seems to be a push to reverse a lot of those things, particularly in voting and other kinds of aspects of the tremendous progress that we've made. And so we have to stay vigilant and stay active to make sure that we don't fall into that kind of a trap. And so I'll always say, if they try to make things difficult, we got to try twice as hard.
Right.
If we think about voting, our ancestors worked so hard to
Right.
vote. And they went through so many obstacles, and it looks like we're going to have to go through some as well.
Some of them
So
ourselves, absolutely.
we're just going to have to do it.
Right.
Because the vote is that much important. We're also going to have to make sure that we know our history.
Right.
And so in all of the attempts to, work around history or to not tell the full story, we have to push for the full story. If that doesn't happen in our schools, which I hope it does happen in our schools, we have to do it in our communities, in our organizations, in our churches, in our institutions, which have always been spaces that we've learned. And so places like KROV are places that are going to have to be history centers.
Absolutely.
When I was in school, I didn't learn everything about Black history. My mother and father were there teaching that to me. And so we've got to do it on our own. I believe in helping build our own. In a sense, we have to help build that nation as well.
That's right.
We have a part to play.
We can't let them do it. No one's going to do it for us. Absolutely.
Exactly. We've got to do it on our own. And so, we have so many resources at our disposal right now. The internet, access to it. We've got access to media. We've got access to good, historical sources, Google Scholar, other kinds of things. We're going to have to use it.
Yes, we do.
But it is a interesting time to be African American or person of color in America.
Right, not just African American, just people of color. Absolutely.
Asian American, Pacific Islanders, Latinos, Native Americans. Lots of people are catching it right now in many ways.
Yes, and that's why I really, really was glad to see the republishing of "The Nation Must Awake." My witness to the Tulsa Race Riot. You guys, Trinity University Press was generous enough to send me the book, which I read. So a lot of people try to say. I mean, some people, like on Fox News, they try to say that the Tulsa riots never happened. It was all a fake, and they tried to do the same thing about the Holocaust. And it was
same
really
thing about January 6th right now.
It did like January 6th. And I was really interested to see how the TEA bent over backwards to make sure that the Holocaust story is told accurately. Why do you think they haven't tried to do the same thing with Tulsa?
I think Tulsa is. Sometimes we find out that it's easier for some people who want to tell a story that doesn't happen here than stories that do happen here and that involve people that we know. I've always said that the history of slavery is difficult for some people because it may involve their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and their great-great-grandparents. On the other end, I always say, well, it includes my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. And sometimes those great-great-grandparents and others are the same people.
That's right. That's right.
But I think it's difficult for America as we define ourselves in such a nation where we define heroes. And when we look at how we look at heroes, we want our heroes to be perfect. And slavery and slave owners mean that you ain't perfect. And so those two ideals don't always fit. Well, we know people are human beings.
Right.
They make mistakes. We all
all make mistakes.
And when we put people on a pedestal, we then set up a situation where we dismiss all the information that says the opposite. Well, the reality is slavery was a system in America that existed for hundreds of years, and it didn't start in America. Now, we perfected I don't say the word perfected, but we made certain things different here, and we built that system in such a way that Americans say it was different from almost every other type of slavery. But you got to look at it. You got to analyze it. And so I think that that's what makes it difficult for people, that they don't want to do it. And there's a racial component to it as well.
Right.
When we deal with Black pain and Black trauma, this country hasn't done a good job of addressing it or reconciling it, because sometimes that's in opposition to what we define as America. The reality of the fact is America and the Black experience is so intertwined, you can't separate the two.
That's right.
How do we know what, we talk about liberty. Well, how do we know what liberty is if we don't know the reverse?
That's right.
Well, that's the African American experience.
That's right.
And, we talk about, well, Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, he really didn't, but that's a whole other thing. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, what those things meant, Juneteenth, what that thing meant. Well, then you look at Jim Crow. Well, how do those things reconcile with that? So many of the things that happen to the African American and the African American experience almost run counter to the narrative that we talk about.
Right.
So how do we combine these two narratives into a more truthful narrative? And I think that's what's difficult for us to reconcile and for people to want to address. The reality is we've got to do it because the history's out there. Tulsa and these kinds of things are not things that people don't know. It's just kind of behind the surface that now is starting to come out. And now it's exploded when we talk about, everybody's talking about Tulsa right now. And it's not just Tulsa. We want to talk, not just Tulsa, we're talking about Wilmington, Atlanta, Springfield, East St. Louis. Washington, all of these different places have got these race riots.
Right.
And it's around the same time, Rosewood.
Right.
Around the same time, the early 20th century up to about the 1920s, there was a Great Depression. And so we got a real issue in which we need to address what was happening in America at that time that exploded all of this. Not that it got better afterwards or was better beforehand, but this is a point in time in American history that we really need to focus on because there was something really going on. And part of it was Black wealth.
Right.
This is African Americans are now 40 years out of slavery. So you got a generation or two. They're building wealth. That's really what Tulsa was. Tulsa wasn't the only Black Wall Street going on. You got Richmond, you got Wilmington, you got Winston-Salem, you got Atlanta, you got all these Black communities that are building wealth.
Yeah.
And they're doing it almost in separate worlds.
Right.
But they're doing well. That offends a lot of people.
It offends many people. Yes,
and because of that, you got a lot of lynchings. People say, well, lynchings were because of Black men and white women. No, lynchings were because of Black wealth.
Absolutely.
And that was what created that. Tulsa was because of, you had the situation in Tulsa where you had the Black man who tripped into the white woman in the elevator.
Right.
But it really was about Black wealth.
That's what it was about.
They just weren't destroying Black buildings. They were looting Black houses, taking away Black wealth. And so Black wealth sometimes runs counter to the American narrative, and it scares a lot of people. And so when we talk about American history, we have to talk about how Black achievement has often been such a threat to the larger society.
And it's quite amazing, actually, that as a people that have had so many, so much tragedy throughout their history, that we continue to evolve and to grow and to everything else. Look at the number of people in office now. We've got more people of color, more women, than we've ever had, even right after Reconstruction.
In spite of,
that's right.
And that's the story that I always like to tell about our history is, we have a history of overcoming.
Right.
And I find it dangerous sometimes to only focus on the negative.
Right.
When you look at, we're not talking about Tulsa now, but Tulsa, many of those people rebuilt this stuff from the ground up with
no
help whatsoever.
no help from the
and
government.
that was wrong because they should have been compensated
Yep, they
for
should
that.
have been. They should have been.
But at the same time, the spirit of the people to overcome that economically, but also psychologically, it took a hell of a lot. Excuse my language. It took a heck of a lot to do that.
Absolutely.
And that shows the strength of a people to overcome the most extreme obstacles. And when you got a people like that, you can't hold them down.
Right. And I think that is what the bigger concern is among many people out there in the conservative press, so to speak, because you know some of those people are there in spite of themselves, but not because of their qualifications.
Yes.
And when they look and they see the first black president, the first black female vice president, and all these other things happening, people with Ph.D s, and people who are in charge of things that were never in charge of before. You
think about Tulsa. In 1920, you've got the place called the Stratford Hotel. It's a 54-room hotel. By black people, descendants of slaves are doing this. Descendants of free black people are building communities with nothing. They're not bringing generations of wealth into it.
They started
and that's
scratch.
Another thing. When we look at the wealth gap in our nation, black people are dealing with generally 10% of what white wealth is.
That's right.
And that's something that really hasn't changed since those times to now. And so when you look at what we've accomplished with so much less and not passed on from generation to generation, that's a lot too. And so when you say that these people built this with nothing, imagine if you're just somebody who's had every advantage or privilege to say, and you look at this person whose family, whose parents were slaves, and they got a hotel.
Think about that.
And you sitting up
a bank.
Yeah, a bank.
They're giving out loans. They're giving out loans, and white people can't get loans.
And you're like, dang, how do they do that?
Right.
That's the shock, I think, and the expectation. How, and that's where envy and jealousy comes into play.
Yes, it does.
And that can create a dangerous concoction that leads to mob violence. And you got a group of people that are doing better than people who think that they're superior to them, who've had all of the advantages, and then they're looking for excuses for how did they accomplish that, or how can I take that away from them? Now we say the excuses, that's affirmative action, which ain't the case.
No, that's right. No, because they basically, thanks to the Supreme Court, I mean, much of affirmative action has been...
It's been good.
It's been good, it's over,
And it's not just aimed at African Americans. And you can't put a person into a job that's not qualified.
That's right.
Affirmative action doesn't say you're not qualified.
No, it says, and that goes back to when they are, now the big deal is now amongst many of the conservatives is to do away with critical race theory and anything that even touches on that. And I don't necessarily agree with everything with the critical race theory, but I think the concept is what needs to happen if people are going to overcome some of the things that you just discussed.
I think the one thing that we have to always do is to look at history and to find the truth.
Right.
And we have to be accurate. And that comes from both sides.
That's absolutely right.
We can't have a perspective, a prejudiced perspective, where you have to come to it open-minded.
That's right.
And for African Americans, we always must look at history in an open-minded way. Because more than any, people of color should want to study history for the sake of knowledge.
That's right.
And we know what happens when it has not been told accurately.
That's
so, to me, if you look throughout American history, if you tell the truth is there.
That's right.
And it's clear to see. And the thing for me is we should not be afraid of the truth.
No.
We should.
The truth is the truth.
Exactly. And we always say, if you don't learn from it, you will repeat your mistakes.
That's right.
And in many senses, I fear that we're repeating many of the same mistakes. When you take
I agree.
January 6th and you say that didn't really happen, or it didn't happen, it wasn't that serious, then you go back into all these other times in history where you say, Tulsa wasn't serious.
That's right.
Or Wilmington wasn't serious. And so if you look at history, you compare those things, you see some of the same aspects and underpinnings. Where, as a historian or an academic or a thinker, you peel those things away and you say, what can I do, or what should we do to not do this again?
I agree.
We should not want Tulsa to ever happen again, or anything like it.
Well, I mean, look at what we. If my number is correct, 48,000 African Americans die of coronavirus, and that much overrepresented.
And we know the reasons why.
And we know the reasons why.
Yes, coronavirus itself was not prejudice.
That's right.
It wasn't the virus, but the things that led to it having a higher effect, diabetes,
right.
high blood pressure, those kinds of things that affect African Americans, those are aspects of systemic racism.
That's right.
And environmental issues
right.
as well, where we're living, the kinds of jobs that we're doing.
Absolutely.
If you're first responders or you're people that are, you're not in place that you can be separate, or you're living in houses with people in close proximity.
Right.
All of those things that African Americans and other people, poorer people, were doing, were exposing us to these kinds of conditions.
No Whole Foods in the ghetto.
Exactly. And we felt the consequence. People who don't go to doctors.
That's right.
Or
Ever.
who may not be, if they see something, well, I just got a little bit of this, it's no big deal
right.
until it's too late.
That's right.
It was horrible.
Do you remember Clark Black?
Yes.
So I used to go to his lighthouse meetings with several of them. And one of the more compelling things that he shared with us one day was that the worst thing that ever happened to African Americans, to black people, was desegregation. And you look at that and you're like, we fought all those years to be equal and this and that and everything else, and you're saying that was a bad thing. Well, because what ended up happening is, the HBCUs started getting more washed down, and because the more quality scholars and athletes went to, the bigger, state-run universities. The people that had graduated from those same universities now didn't want to live in the neighborhood where their parents and cousins and friends lived. They wanted to live somewhere else where they could show off the trappings of their success by living in, different neighborhoods and things of such nature. And when all that stuff happens, then you have a certain group of people who are left there with no resources to help them get better, no role models to model after, and that's a huge problem. And I don't see an answer to that. What are your thoughts?
I don't necessarily fully agree with Reverend Black on that. Reverend Black, I love Reverend Black. I went to his church for many, and I still do. But I get where he's coming from, and I think I'll give you this perspective.
Okay.
When integration came at a cost to African Americans.
Yes, it did.
And we almost had to say that our institutions were not as good as. If you look at what we were saying during Brown versus Board of Education, we were almost saying that our institutions weren't as good as. So psychologically, that had an effect, I think.
That's right.
And so we said, well, our schools couldn't do this, and we could only find equality in these schools. Well, the thing is, I believe that integration was the right thing to do because we were paying taxes.
Yes, we were.
And we should have been equally compensated for those things. And we know that black schools were not equally
They were not funded the way they should have been funded.
And you could not do it.
Right.
Segregation was economically problematic because there was not enough money to fund all of these things equally.
Right.
So guess who got the short end of the stick?
We
did. But if you look at the Negro Leagues, when Jackie Robinson integrated baseball, great thing, it gutted the Negro Leagues.
Yes, it did.
And so we have to think about what we paid for it and how we psychologically started to think of ourselves, I think, as, well, our things weren't good enough. Our radio stations weren't good enough. Our HBCUs weren't good enough. Our churches weren't good enough. And that was, I think, the wrong perspective to take. We deserved. We were justice says that we deserve those things.
That's right.
But we should have found a way to come to it on an equal standing, if that was possible, and say that our institutions were good, because they were doing great things.
Oh, they were, absolutely.
And I think that got lost.
I mean, they were great scholars before integration.
Yeah, W.B. Du Bois was
absolutely.
Probably I would say the greatest American scholar ever. And many others. Kelly Miller, I can go down the line. These brothers and sisters were doing it.
Right.
And our newspapers were so strong.
Right.
The black press, if you look at Tulsa, the black press was talking about Tulsa. The black press was talking about Brownsville. They were talking about things that the mainstream media wasn't talking about.
That's right.
And they were undergirding the black community. And sometimes, even as black folk, we think that our things aren't good enough.
That's right.
And that is a problem that we have always faced.
Well, it's like if you keep repeating something over and over and over again, your subconscious adopts it.
We fought, we can sometimes talk, and I'm going to probably get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it. We sometimes talk a lot about racism and what the man is doing to me. But sometimes a man is the person looking in the mirror.
Right.
And what we do to
ourselves.
ourselves. The way we beat ourselves up for how we look.
Yep.
Even in black comedy, look at how black comedy talks about black people's looks.
Yep.
We talk about kids and call them a hookhead or this or that. You don't hear other communities talking about their people in such negative kinds of ways.
No.
And so the way we cut ourselves up says to me something about our perception of ourselves. And
Absolutely.
sometimes we need to turn the thing inside. Intra-racially.
That's right.
And we can heal ourselves. There's a lot of things with the large society we can't change, but we can certainly change what we think about ourselves.
Absolutely.
And so we should support our communities and our people in the communities that are trying to do right instead of doing some of the things that we sometimes do.
I agree, 1,000%. That's a very awesome perspective. Now, tell us a little bit here before we go about the nation. The nation must awake. What's your opinion of the book? Give me.
This is perhaps. I don't say perhaps. This is the first-person perspective that we get out of Tulsa.
Yeah.
So this is the first-person survivor of Tulsa. She's a woman. She's got a child. She's a very intelligent woman, brilliant woman, educated, very good writer. And so she's intertwined into Tulsa's community. You can see she compiles also not just her own recollections, but other recollections of it as well. And I think she was hired by some commission to do this work. But to think about a black woman in 2021, doing this, being hired to do this. So she's dealing with the racial aspect,
right,
but she's also dealing with the gendered aspect.
Absolutely.
She talks about what happened before Tulsa, what Tulsa was like, the devastation, how she was basically forced out of her house. So she endures all of the destruction of Tulsa. And you can think about how would a woman with her kid, with her daughter, forced out of their house in the morning, I believe it was in the morning.
In the morning, yeah.
Memorial Day weekend. And just struggling, leaving, taking all your stuff, not being able to take a shower.
It took whatever they could carry.
Take whatever you can carry. And all these people basically chasing you out. And you're basically on a caravan, getting in vehicles or whatever, seeing people walking up the street, seeing dead bodies along the way. And it's a very visceral look at what Tulsa really was. You know, we can wash Tulsa out and say, well, 75 to 300 people died and there were 30 blocks destroyed. But when you hear her talk about individual experiences, like dead bodies, maybe they weren't dead, maybe they were just injured along the way, people screaming, people hollering, that's what she brings to the table.
Yeah.
And she brings a respectability also to the table. The people that she's interviewing, these are some of the most intelligent people that any community would have.
Right.
And they're talking about their experiences, but they're also talking about how they're surviving. And that's one of the things that I think that's important for this, she's talking about survival. She's a survivor. But she's also saying that the nation must awake. And why would you say it must awake? Tulsa is already destroyed. But I think she's pointing us that this can happen again. And she uses a lot of imagery of war. And there's a reason she's using imagery of war. Because Tulsa wasn't just destroyed from the ground, it was destroyed from the air. And this is 1921.
That's right.
And airplanes haven't been around for a long time.
That long.
And you're just coming out of World War I. And so you've got soldiers, black and white, who are on both sides of this battle. And you've got this battle, this war zone. And you look at the pictures of Tulsa, it's a war zone. It looks like France in World War I.
That's right.
And that's the imagery that she uses. She's coming out of Red Summer in 1919. She's using, our world was at a particular period of time where we were thinking about war again.
Right.
And she's comparing this to that and saying that if we don't awake, we will go through this again. And she was right. And I think that her message to us is still strong today, that if we don't awake and try to straighten out a lot of these issues that we have with race.
That's right.
Issues that we have with class. Issues that we have with poverty. Then issues that we have with false news. And when I'm going to say the word false and not trying to get the true narrative. Because what happened here? A false narrative.
That's right.
The man, the best evidence says the man tripped and he touched the woman.
He touched her.
And he gets put in prison for assault, and the news media blows it out of proportion.
Right.
we have to be very careful with our information sources and that they are completely vetted and accurate.
Have you ever heard of, I'm sure you have, Camp Logan?
Mm-hmm.
And very similar, stories there. If you watch the movie 1917, it makes it look like, oh, these white guys out here, a black woman, and everything was fine, and these guys came and just started. And when you kind of look back and you read through the history of that and how it's been just really just twisted and turned around, it seems like that always happens.
Yeah.
To try to marginalize the effects and the impacts of these things.
Riots that we were talking about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
these massacres,
Mm-hmm.
almost all of them had a media that was printing stories in the days ahead.
Yep.
If you look at Atlanta in 1906,
Yep.
the Atlanta media, news stories, they were printing stories about black men doing this, doing this, doing this. If you look at the raid that was in Brownsville in 1906,
mm-hmm.
the media was printing stories, sensationalized stories.
Yep.
And for people who don't know how to vet sources, they believe it.
They believe it.
And we have to be media has to be very careful of what it does. And now we have a similar kind of thing happening now where you have media, many of them just printing anything that they want to say and anything that they want to think and no accountability, and people are believing this. And then when you have groups of people believing it, it turns into mobs.
That turns into mobs.
And mobs will do what individuals won't do.
That's right.
And mobs, those individuals in Tulsa probably would have done this.
That's right.
But as a mob,
they would. That's right.
That's being deputized and put into the police force.
That's right.
They did it.
And that's how it always is. It's always a mob against
violence.
A few.
Absolutely.
Carey Latimore, Ph.D., History Associate Professor, Trinity. You taught us all a ton today. Thank you so much for taking out your so much time, and really, I apologize for taking over the amount of time that we had, but it was just such an interesting conversation.
I enjoyed this. We'll have to do it again.
We will have to do it again.
Again.
Thank you so much. KRV-FM, the heart and soul of San Antonio. Go out and get the book, The Nation Must Awake, My Witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921.
Trinity University Press.
Trinity University Press. So go check it out. Go get it. You can get it online. But it's something that will really awaken you, and you'll see similarities to what's going on today. Thanks so much, Carey. You're awesome. Thank your wife for coming out with you. KRV-FM, the heart and soul of San Antonio. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
All right.